You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency critique and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Deva Woodly, who teaches in the Department of Politics at the New School for Social Research in New York City, where she also directs the Mellon Initiative for Inclusive Faculty Excellence. Deva has published widely on democratic theory and practice, focusing on the function of public meaning formation and its effects on self and collective understanding of the polity, employing multiple methods to understand the power of discourse in shaping democratic life. She is the author of The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance, published in 2015 by Oxford University Press, as well as Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, also published by Oxford University Press in late 2021, and is the occasion for our conversation today. Deva, welcome. It's so great to have you here. I really appreciate you making the time to talk about your book today.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here to get to have a conversation with you.
Well, I did want to just start off saying, I was excited. I knew this book was coming out, and I'm a pre-order person. Put in my pre-order, and I had really high hopes for the book because I think it's such an urgent topic. It's extremely important. And I have to say, it really exceeded those hopes. I think it's both really well written. It's written with such a deep moral core that I think all the invocations that you want out of the book, all the imperatives you want out of the book, really hit, both because of your writing and because of your analysis. So I just wanted to start off saying that it's one of the most interesting and energizing books I've read in a really, really long time.
That is so amazing to hear you say. I'm so happy that it comes through. This book was actually quite difficult for me to write because it went against my sort of investment in it and the way that I wanted that investment to come through. Was a little bit counter to my training as an empirical political scientist, which is supposed to be a little bit more sort of guarded and, cleansed of of emotional content in favor of rigor, right? And so I wanted to make sure that it was both rigorous, but there was also a really strong indication of intentionality and position and ethical commitment as well, right? I did want it to have the tone of an appeal, right? But I felt it was kind of dangerous to do that. And so I had to wrestle with myself a little bit in order to try to make it work. So I'm glad that it came through.
It absolutely did. I mean, it doesn't, it's actually surprises me to hear that, the behind the scenes part of writing, being a writer is always its own kind of drama. But that certainly doesn't come across that sort of hesitation or whatever, however you want to characterize it. I think it's really boldly put and argued. And those moral, ethical, political injunctions are just so clear, and it's a very readable book without moving outside of its complexity. I mean, I think it's a really great balance between the complexity of the issues you examine and the clear desire to connect in ways that aren't simply around abstract, right, political concepts and so forth. And, but it's interesting to hear you say that about your own sort of, your own recalibration as a writer. And so maybe I wanted to start with a question along those lines, which is, why this project now, and why in the way that you wrote it? And I say that because, as we all know, when you write a book, it's a full existential commitment, right? Everything gets set aside so that you can do this. And
Mm-hmm.
so much is at stake professionally, personally, spiritually, emotionally, energy. So something motivates us to write these books, right? Something really pulls us. And what is it that drew you to this project, to write it and to write it now and to write it in the way that you did?
Well, this was an accidental book project. It's my second book, and I had already had a second book project planned that is separate from this one, and will now be my third book project, a project on economic discourse that very much sort of follows the format methodologically of my first book, which is a mixture of political theoretic methods, qualitative and quantitative methods. And so I was going to, build a discourse database and do interviews all over the country and sort of ground it all in kind of Aristotelian theories of eudaimonia and flourishing. And it was going to be very, very sort of hard to do, but very neat and tidy in terms of my relationship to it. I understood how to deal with that data. But during the time that I was researching that book and building my data sets, that was 2013, 2014. And that was the moment of the birth of a new Black liberation movement. And as a social movement scholar and as a Black woman, I just couldn't look away, literally, from the proliferation of horrifying videos that were online, but then also the discourse of people who were actually in and creating movement spaces at that time. And, I didn't immediately pivot to writing about the Black Lives Matter movement at that time. What actually made me start writing about it was that I thought that people kept missing the complexity of what was going on, and that the sort of pieces that I was reading about the social movement, especially the short pieces and popular media pieces, were getting a lot of things either wrong or assessing them in a really shallow and short-term way that didn't reflect what I saw emerging as the really different approach that this movement was taking as a social movement, the kind of awareness the movement had of the importance of meaning making, the kind of grounding of their revolutionary, I think, or at least radical claims, which I think was really different than 20th century movements that we might think of as radical. So I just felt like the kind of work coming out assessing the movement at that time, in 2014, 15, 16, wasn't getting at some of the stuff that I thought was most important, influential, and innovative about what folks were doing. And I also wanted to do a project that considered not only the movement as a social movement, but the place of social movements in democracy, because I thought something interesting was also going on in terms of democracy itself and what the social movement seemed to be doing. The moment that there are two moments where I understood myself to be actually writing a book. So as I started noticing these things, I started writing like short pieces that were about small observations, right? Like, so observations about leadership, observations about discourse, right? And the injection of things like self-care into our popular discourse and the political implications of that. So I started writing short pieces, and I would do little talks on these short pieces. And at one of the talks on the short pieces, someone was asking me, oh, well, this is like very interesting what you're saying about what social movements do in democracy. When is the book coming out? And I said, I'm not writing I don't know. And that was sort of like a moment of realization for me when I was like, oh, I guess I am writing a book. And the thing that had kind of accelerated my production of these shorter pieces was that in the summer of 2016, so before the election, in August, a poll from the Pew Research Center came out that had public approval ratings for a variety of different things. And something that was very, very strange and unusual is that the Black Lives Matter movement was polling in approval ahead of both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Um, and and I just thought that was unprecedented. I mean, it is unprecedented, right?
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
um, and the movement polls at about that, and this was like, it was a small difference. It was like, um, you know, um, Donald Trump was polling at like 46% approval, and Hillary Clinton was polling at 45% approval, and movement was polling at 48% approval, or something like that. So it was a small difference, and within um, the the um, the margin of error, but still, social movements don't poll like that, especially when they're kind of
Absolutely.
like fresh out the gate. Like, this was 2016, so probably 3 or 4 years into the life of the movement, and it had been a very kind of tumultuous start, right? um,
Sure. Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
and um, and so I just was like, I have to think this through in a very systematic way.
I really like that that the or realizing you're writing a book when somebody asks you what your book is about.
Yes,
That's kind of a
that's
that's a
exactly what happened.
that's actually a phenomenal moment, and um, it both makes me laugh. I have I can actually think of a couple of occasions where I had similar origins myself. Um, but it also, I mean, it does speak to the value of intellectual community. Often we give talks and we can be virtuous and say, I want feedback or I want to just, share my ideas. And sometimes that's true. And sometimes that's, how we justify our sociality as academics. But there is that very real dimension of people seeing something in what you're saying that, we don't necessarily see for ourselves. So I like that as a as a way of reminding me, at least, of the importance of these intellectual communities, right? Just getting that
Absolutely,
sort of feedback because people do always see, whether it's a friend, a partner, or a colleague, see something about us we don't see, and this is a
absolutely.
particularly productive one. Those are usually negative things they know about us, but I like this is a much happier one. Well, so it's interesting. So you're talking about the sort of origins of this project in 1516, the sort of emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives. Um, but I want to ask you about the title and the subtitle, but
Sure.
especially the title, which itself is very much evocative of the past year and a half,
Hmm.
right? Reckoning. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think this word reckoning does as a title? It was, of course, for at least some elements of our national media, was a way of talking about the protests after the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Of course, people started talking about national reckoning, so it
Hmm.
evokes that, but in that way evokes a very recent iteration of protest and uprising. But then there's also in the subtitle this phrase "democratic necessity," which, as you've already spoken to, that this is the idea of democracy in relation to this movement and to
Hmm.
movements in general is essential for your thinking generally and in this book in particular.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering two things. Why this word reckoning? What drew you to that word to make it a title? That's an important decision we make. And also democratic necessity. What motivates your work to connect Black Lives Matter, movement for Black lives, to thinking about democracy and democratic action and process more broadly?
Okay, so thank you for this question. And it's actually, I think, really important in terms of thinking through what I think that the work is, both the work of this book, but also the political work of this moment. Um, so the word reckoning, when it comes to words, I love, I love their actual definitional meanings and their origins, right? I think that that tells us a lot about,
Me too. Yeah.
yes, about sort of, um, you know, the differences between, or the divergence and overlap between denotation and connotation, and how they have sort of evolved and developed over time. So reckoning is the action or process of calculating or estimating something, right? Its impact. And archaically, right, it is literally a bill or account and its settlement. So
I didn't know that.
Right. But then in sort of more, 19th century usage, reckoning is about memory, right? It is about, uh, yeah, it's about like what you remember and what you think about what you remember. So the memory and the analysis are together, right? When in the sort of casual uses, do you reckon? Right? Which is a kind of, so I love the polysemy of the word reckoning, because I
Mm-hmm.
felt like that reflected the process, right? The political process that was going on.
Absolutely.
And it also reflected the kind of contingency of that process in a
Mm-hmm.
way that I really wanted to take seriously, um, because this, to reckon, right, is a process. It's not actually the final account, right? It is the
Yeah.
process of going through, trying to figure out the meaning and significance of what has occurred, and figuring out how we are going to remember and analyze the things that are taking place and what they mean for us. So I felt like that was actually what was going on, and what movement was pushing the American polity, and indeed the global polity, to do, is to try to make sense of this state-sanctioned, you know, murder, harassment, and theft from Black people in a different way, right? In a different
Mm-hmm.
light, to rethink, recalculate, um, um, remember, right, in a different way
Mm-hmm.
than had been usual at that time, and to encourage reimaginings, right, of what might be possible, in future, but also reimagine what might be necessary in the present.
Yeah.
So I thought all of that was sort of contained in the notion of reckoning. And then in terms of the subtitle, was the original title of the whole manuscript. Like the whole time I was working on the manuscript, it was called Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. So that was a constant from the very beginning,
Mm-hmm.
because what I understand about social movements, and what seemed to me to be made very clear in the case of Black Lives Matter, or the Black Lives Matter movement, is that we often think about social movements as disruptions of a kind of normal order of democratic politics,
Mm-hmm.
but they're integral to democratic politics, and indeed, democratic politics can't exist without social movements.
Right.
And that's because institutions, no matter how virtuously designed, become self-serving rather than mission-serving over time. They just do.
Yeah.
And so social movements are the things that allow democracies to remain democratic, and to not sort of contract into completely non-responsive oligarchy, which is
Mm-hmm.
the tendency of all institutions.
Yeah, I love both those answers. And at the subtitle, this democratic necessity, as you just articulated it, that's such a deeply impactful part of the book, right? And there are lots of aspects of the book that I think leave a deep impression, and that's one that really left a deep impression for me. It's one of those things that I think I intuitively
Mm-hmm.
connected, but once you start to talk about the decadence that comes from institutions left to themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right, uncontested, and so forth, that, and putting that word necessity after democratic is just so important in the way you articulated it. For people who haven't read the book, I mean, when you read the book, it's like you really feel it, right? But it's conceptually and strategically such an important thing to see. I mean, I wish we could just say as a nation, we need more protest, right? To keep our democracy vital. Obviously, that's our slippage out of democracy in the way we have to always remind institutions of their own vitality. But that your embrace of the multiple resonances, but also sort of coalescing multiple resonances of this word reckoning is just, to me, is so interesting and important. And it's a way of saying, and I wanted to ask about it because the word existed in certain elements of national media as a way of talking about that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But your use of it in the book and as a title and in the book is not, as you just articulated, it's not a sort of title version of clickbait,
No.
we talked about that, but instead really gets inside the term. And I have to say, just in case any student happened to listen to this is why I say when they're writing papers or theses, I always say, take your key terms and go get the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yes.
Learn the history of these words because
it's so important.
They will open up horizons you hadn't expected. You end up saying more than you meant in a really great way.
It is so enlightening and so clarifying for one's thinking, I think. And, it's also important that the use of reckoning in this way is not a monument to a moment. Instead, it's the name of a process, right? And a process that is ongoing, and it has to be, because that's the other thing, is that this book is rooted in a sort of theoretically pragmatic, philosophically pragmatic place, which privileges iteration, right? Mm-hmm. Which understands democratic process to always be ongoing, and that the process is what is sacred and beneficial to humanity and polities, not any institutions that we might design, because over time institutions have to be built and dismantled based on their usefulness, right? If you're a pragmatist, right? If a thing doesn't work anymore, according to the values and meanings of, agreed upon in a polity, mm-hmm. then you have to change it. And that's not a disaster. And it's just a part of what actual democratic process is. If we are living and vital human beings who are responding to conditions both inside of the societies that we create, but also exogenous conditions of environment, material resources, mm-hmm. et cetera, you have to change over time. That's our gift. And it's one that we, as human beings, and it's one that we should accept with intention, rather than sort of trying to build monuments that never change, and declare them sacred in a way that precludes their revision, or putting them away. So I also wanted to sort of highlight the process aspect of it, and the livingness of this, also of the democratic process, because I think that is writing against a lot of the sort of democratic theory scholarship of the 20th century, which was really, really interested in finding the kind of equilibrium, the best equilibrium points, or the ideal points at which everything could be balanced forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah.
And that's not realistic, and it's harmful. And it's harmful because it makes it so that it's very difficult to respond to conditions in the moment, and it's really hard to make revisions and admit mistakes, et cetera, et cetera. And so. So I just wanted to emphasize, hey, folks, we're actually all in this together, and it's really important to understand the process of it all.
I really like the way you put that. I mean, I think this, in principle, it's important, but it also is really embodied in the kind of writing you do in the book.
Thank you. I mean, I tried. I mean, you make me sound much more like strategic than it felt. I think that I was trying to convey everything that I learned
Sure.
from the movement in the process. That's the other thing that's really important to say, is that like I did not um, I did not know what would be required to write this book, or even the form that it would take. Because at first I thought that I was going to write a little book, like a little brief on my theory about social movements and democratic necessity, using like a very small, like a kind of description of focusing actually on the organizational form of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I thought was really different and impactful and would like make a splash in terms of social movement studies. And I was just going to do this little book about this. But my work is almost always inductive. It is always inductive and
Uh,
empirical. So,
uh-huh.
so I was like, well, I can't write this without talking to people. And as I started the interview process, I started to notice that people kept telling me the same kinds of, kept articulating a very consistent list of values. Um,
Interesting.
and kind of also like interpretive processes from different organizations at different levels in the organizations, both when I was talking to them in kind of formal, long, unstructured interviews, and when I just happened to be like run into them or be in virtual spaces with them where I had a short moment to talk to them. Like in each one of these, people kept articulating very similar things. And I was just like, there's actually a whole political philosophy here.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I can actually write this book without trying to understand and to codify what I think that this political philosophy is, because it's consistent, right? It's consistent across organizations and different regions. And it's something that folks have developed by talking to each other. And it's a kind of baseline that people seem to agree on. And furthermore, it undergirds, right? It gives the reasoning for the organizational form that I want to talk about, right? Because the organizational form makes sense because of these values. So it ended up being a bigger book than I expected. And as I learned about the political philosophy, I was also just moved by it. Like I was just moved, and I wanted to convey what I thought was, what I think is the incredibly useful gift of this 21st century philosophy, which is an amalgam, um, of previous philosophies, right, that have
Mhm.
existed, but with innovations that make it relevant for these times, because of the lessons that we have learned about many of the 20th century philosophies and their detriments, and the 20th century organizational forms, right, for social movements and their detriments. Um, so yeah, so that's what I mean by this book was difficult to write, is that as I was writing it, I was trying to figure out how I could convey what I saw as the complexity and depth of what was going on and its relevance to other parts of the discipline. And that's part of, I think, what makes this book a little strange, and for people to sometimes for people to sort of deal with and encounter, is that I'm trying to convey the radicalism of the movement, but also put it in conversation with, conventional social movements and political theory
Mhm.
discourses,
Mhm.
but in a way that doesn't privilege those discourses, but makes them a part of a conversation. And it's a tricky thing to do. It makes them a part of a conversation because I do believe that knowledge production is always a conversation. I don't think that you
Yeah.
can kind of supersede what has come before in a way that kind of can dismiss or ignore it. And you can't. And this is different people feel differently about this, but I also don't feel like you can ignore dominant discourses, um, if what you're trying to do is to move beyond them. I think that
Yeah.
you have to deal with them in some way. So um, yeah, so that's kind of what I was wrestling with, is like how to do all of those things, without as much as I can without reifying discourses that actually don't describe what the movement is doing, which I think is new.
And I think what you say about knowledge production being conversation, collaboration, is also true about writing. When you said, I wasn't sort of, I was making it sound intentional. What I think is interesting is what often gets called, I'm a theorist, a pure theorist. And so, my field is often accused of being jargony and that sort of thing. But I always say, that's part of writing is a sense of immersion.
Mm-hmm.
And your sensibilities are changed by your immersion in what you're writing about. And so you end up, it's not mimicry. It's really a sensibility that emerges out of that conversation, whether they're with texts or in your case with activists, in the streets, reflecting on, or even just speaking in the moment to their work. And so I think our writerly sensibilities come out of those conversations in the same way that, as you say, knowledge production does. The content and the depth on the page, right, and the words and the phrasing and the sound of what we write. I think it comes from that same space, and in that way, I think intentional or not, it's intention at the deepest level of, you intended to be in conversation with these people rather than speak above them. And that moment changes how you produce knowledge, but I think also how you write. So,
yeah, no, I think that's true.
I want to ask you, in some ways now, I've asked you about the title, subtitle, and then we haven't even opened the book, although you've walked through the book a lot. I wanted to ask you about the cover. And I don't, most covers are just kind of boring and, or there's, some designer at the press, I'm thinking about me, picks a couple of things, runs some options by you. But I absolutely love the cover of your book. It took me a while to actually open it. I just loved it. I mean, it has this collage of photos.
Yes.
And then it has butterflies superimposed. And it's amazing. And so I was like, well, this isn't just a title that was mailed in, or a cover that was mailed in, right? It clearly is a cover that is saying something. And so I just wanted to ask you about it.
Thank you so much for asking about it, because this was another thing that was a little bit uncomfortable for me. Because it's I think it's a really weird cover for an academic book. It's, it's a piece of art. And I know it's a piece of art because I commissioned it from an artist. So I wanted for the cover of this book, again, for this to feel, in every part that I could make it, the vitality of the sort of political enterprise, right? The political invention, and the experimentalism and the boldness that I think I was trying to talk about, right? In the text, I wanted to be reflected in every way, and that included the cover. And so, with my first book, absolutely the same process that you talked about happened, right? Like, I was like, I don't know. I just need to get it out. Here are the colors that I would like to use. Like, hopefully you'll make something happen. And I didn't really think that much about it, honestly. But this book, I really wanted it to be intentional. And I wanted it to be bold and joyful. Because I think that the movement is bold and joyful amidst the sorrow, anger, exhaustion that also always accompanies multi-generational liberation movements, right? That are, right, and continue to be ongoing. But I think that when we write about movements, when we write about anti-Blackness, when we write about the sort of terrorism of the police state, all of these things, we often emphasize the sort of heaviness of, the problems that we face, right? And for good reason. But what inspired and moved me most, honestly, about this movement was the kind of effervescence and livingness of it. Amidst all of that, and the intention and attention to joy that is built into the political philosophy of the movement, and also the practices, right, that people engage in movement spaces, and the discursive approach that I think is really interesting and different, right? The notion of being unapologetic is not just about attitude, right? It's also a part of a political refusal to approach questions of liberation from a crouch of apology, and but also a refusal to approach from a posture um, of never-ending sacrifice and war, right? And I wanted that to be conveyed, and I remember, so all that's like kind of long to say. The cover is inspired in two ways. One, what really hit me about wanting to emphasize the joyfulness and livingness of this movement, and the way it undergirds the discursive approach of the arguments that are made, is a chant that I witnessed in Chicago at a protest. And the chant is, it's nothing about the police. It's nothing about, overcoming, right? It's like so it doesn't have these, it's not like, ain't no power but the power of the people, like all the chants that we made for this chant is, I love Black people, you don't love Black people, what's wrong with you? Repeated over and over again in a kind of polyrhythmic chant, call and response, and it's just joy, like like the whole, you know what I mean, like it, and it's not a demand, it's not a kind of overt sort of assertion of power, although the power is demonstrated in the fact of the massing of the people in the streets, and the activities that accompany and surround that, but this was just a song, yeah, of appreciation, and joy and livingness. And so that really made a big impression on me. And then in addition, there's a story that I heard from several different people that I interviewed of the convening in Ferguson. I'm sorry, not the convening after the Ferguson uprising in Cleveland, Ohio. And that convening took place in 2015. It had a lot of different sort of constituencies of the movement. It was not a smooth convening necessarily. It was large, but people had sort of like fought during the different sort of factions had fought about the approach, and people had wanted to do, this was right after Tamir Rice was killed, and people wanted to do an action, but the folks couldn't agree on what kind of action they wanted to do, so no action was taken, and people were upset, and there was like an internal controversy about what it actually meant to center the marginalized and trans voices, and so there had been all of this contention. But at the end of the gathering, as folks were leaving, there was a Black boy who had been detained by the police right a block or a couple blocks away, so that people would pass, right? People did pass on their way out. And this child, was sitting there in handcuffs, and people started to inquire why he had been taken, and the police told them that he had been drinking, and after people persistently inquired, they said, don't worry about it, it was actually his mom who called the police, and people kept inquiring because that didn't seem right, and the boy was like, it definitely was not my mom, here's my mom, this is her number. They contacted her, and what happened was that all of these different factions who've been fighting about what the right thing to do was and who they might be, and how the moment of Ferguson, right, the Ferguson uprising could be turned into a sustained movement, came together to unarrest this child and return him to his mother, which they did. Everyone told me, now it sounds like an apocryphal story, but I heard this from many people, that when they had gotten the police to release the child to his mother's custody, and the child and his mother were walking toward the car that would take them away, right home, that the people who were there, and there were like about 500 or 600 people there, sort of created a corridor for them to sort of walk through, and they were shouting love and affirmations at them. And they saw butterflies, like randomly. So this is like,
Huh.
I mean, it is
Wow.
spring, so it was spring, but like spring in Ohio. And they saw butterflies that were sort of flying around and seemed to be accompanying these two on their walk. And and it was interesting because it also coincided, that was right after the release of Kendrick Lamar's album To Pimp a Butterfly, and people started sort of burst into the chorus of the song All Right, right,
Yeah.
during that time. So this scene was described to me many different times, and it was the scene in which the possibility of a movement with organizations that were coordinating their activity became possible, because it wasn't clear that it was possible after the convening, but it had to happen in this moment, that was made of joy and magic.
Wow, that's like that is a serious story. I mean, it's like real tears listening to that story. It's really beautiful. And when I saw the butterflies, my first thought was, of course, Kendrick Lamar's album and the role that All Right played and the album played in this particular political moment. But that concrete, corridor, affirmation, love, butterflies appear. Um, it would make a terrible movie, but a perfect human moment. It's like
Yes.
it's that's really amazing. Wow, I'm really glad I asked about the cover. I mean, I do think a number of things in what you said and things that I would evoke for me with the cover. The right wing is, of course, spent years trying to demonize Black Lives Matter movement, and their focus, is always on broken windows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I've always suspected. I'll be honest. I'm suspected. I know in my heart that the thing that I do think was most viscerally unacceptable was Black pleasure,
Mm-hmm.
black happiness expressed in a group. I mean, because it's evasive in the sense of it makes it hard to demonize a protest when people have joy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, of course, one of the foundation stones of anti-blackness is a resistance to Black happiness. And so when I saw the cover, I thought, that, and hearing this story, I'm like, okay, it's much more expansive and amazing than even that intuition. But I also thought about the photograph of the women on the front, in the
Mm-hmm.
way that, as you talked about monument and process, and trying to work process against monumentalization, you know, in ways that I think a lot of media was trying to honor the Black Lives Matter movement in creating icons and creating these photographs that are perfectly lit of, really gorgeous organizers who are,
Mm-hmm.
they're professional photographs and perfectly done. It risks monumentalization, right? In
Mm-hmm.
ways that, and that has nothing to do with the organizers, right? It's just simply, I think, the way the media always wants to monumentalize, but the vulnerability that comes with that.
Mm-hmm.
But that photograph, is regular folks doing work to liberate. And that's
Mm-hmm.
and it's just there. I don't know quite what the word is, because I don't want to say modest photographs, but they have a kind of vernacular everyday photography
But that's
to
because
them
they
that make.
are.
Exactly, and that's what makes that process, right? It's
Yeah.
like these are everyday photographs, and so it's a reminder of, like, this isn't a monumental movement or
Mm-hmm.
monumentalizable movement. It's a process movement
Mm-hmm.
of people, right,
Of
with
people.
butterflies.
Yeah. Well, the artist Key Williams, who is
Yeah,
also,
I was gonna ask the name. Yeah.
yes, yes, Key, who is fantastic and brilliant, in a variety of different ways. Also, a historian of New York, and a person who is very sort of dynamic in terms of, um, you know, liberation movements and progressive movements in general, is also an artist whose art I admired sort of throughout the time that I was doing the research. And I approached Key and I was like, will you do the cover for this book? And that process was also really interesting because at first Key gave me a very like modest cover that was more similar to my first book cover, much plainer, and without the embellishments of like flowers and fauna and things that I actually quite liked in their collage work. And that made me approach them. And I was like, Key, I want you to go all out. I want to see sort of your full vision. I want the colors to be, bright and insane. I'm inspired by the butterfly stories, and I hope that you incorporate them in some way. And Key came up with this collage of pictures of people, because Key was there, right, in Cleveland, and of pictures of snapshots, basically, of people that were taken there in Cleveland, and created this piece. And I just loved it because I do think that it shows the sort of like ordinary process part of it. And for me, that is where the hope that I think is in this book,
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
that's where it comes from, is ordinary people doing this work and transforming in the service of this work, right? As Mary Hook says, right? It's because that is what is important. In order to sort of live in the world that radical Black feminist pragmatism could make, right? A world in which politics is centered around the notion of distributing responsibilities for care, and distributing responsibilities for care with special attention to those who are marginalized and suffering within the systems that are currently in use. Like, in order to sort of live in that world, we also have to be different subjects than we are now. But the process of developing the kind of subjectivity which would allow us to ask questions in a different way and to come up with possibilities for action that are different than the ones that have characterized the 20th century, we also have to become different. But that's not a miraculous thing, right? It's not that you wake up different. It's not a kind of metamorphosis in that sense. Instead, it is really, as Mary Hook says, being transformed in the service of the work. It is another process. It is a thing that happens step by step and day by day and interaction by interaction, and through the work of organizing. And so I wanted the cover to kind of show that and show the joyful side of that. Of course, there's a ton of slog and just quotidian dullness, in addition to the moments of real, like, danger and repression and things that also happen. But yeah, I wanted to emphasize this joyful part of it, this sort of these moments of alchemy.
Yeah, I'm just so glad I asked, because it's a cover that struck me as enormously important, and I'm glad we get the artist's name out there. I'll make sure to put a link in the narrative of the podcast to his work. So you use a phrase and started to unpack it a little bit, but this phrase. I don't know if you want to call it a phrase or like a critical frame or analytical frame of radical Black feminist pragmatism.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you to sort of walk through that phrase a little bit. I mean, you sort of, gave an encapsulation of it just now, but it's such an important phrase. It does so much work across the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in addition to all the things we've already talked about, it's one of the real wide contributions for readers, real wide contributions to thinking politically, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I just want to ask you about the phrase radical Black feminist pragmatism. How does it fit together, but also why these particular terms?
Yes, this was another part that was hard. Because I didn't know. So radical Black feminist pragmatism, I should say, is just the name that I call the political philosophy that I encountered. This is not my political philosophy. I did not I did not dream it up. I couldn't have. I am less, you know. I was trained in a much more sort of cognitive and much less emotional and sort of attention to notions of care, right? Like none of that was part of my training. And so I kept encountering this and I had to try to figure out what I wanted to call it, like this thing that was happening. And so, each sort of part of the term does its own work in trying to describe the values that I think are encapsulated. The radical, part of it is a mode of inquiry, right? So I really wanted to think about radical because I think that the movement thinks about radicalism less as a series of positions, right? Like, so it's not really about positions at the edge of um, accepted discourse or something like that. That's not what radical means. Radical really is about asking questions that get at the radix or root of the phenomena that is being witnessed, right? So it means getting beyond the terms of the given, right? And understanding that in order to address multi-generational problems, and problems that have been, sort of worked over again and again within, the paradigm of modernity, that we actually have to get underneath or beside or around the terms of the given because they're not going to get us where we need to go.
Yeah.
And Black feminism is an ethic, right? So we have this radical mode of inquiry, but then grounding this mode of inquiry is also this sort of, this ethic of which is a constellation of approaches and values that's encapsulated in the political tradition of Black feminism.
Yeah.
And these include a focus on lived experience, right? In terms of, as a basis of the epistemology of how we conceive of political problems, and what things are shared and how they're shared and why they're significant. Also a way of reasoning that is margin to center, right? That tries to think about people who are most impacted by oppressive arrangements of power and privilege, on the logic that that is the only way to actually see not only the full damage of those systems, but also to begin to unravel them, right?
Yeah.
Because in order to sort of like to loose a knot, right, you have to tug at the right place. Otherwise, you just make it more entrenched and entwined and more difficult to disentangle. So, there's a particular logic there that is also at work. And then also with the emphasis on care as political, right? As not only a kind of ethic, as not only a fact of labor and laboring, which a lot of feminist theory talks about it as, but as an actual way of organizing politics and political thought. Right. And then the pragmatism part of it, I thought would be the most controversial, at least for people in movement, because many times people react poorly to the notion of pragmatism because it's thought of colloquially and in relation to kind of like democratic triangulation or the limit of possibilities. But I really meant it in terms of philosophical pragmatism, which is, a way of thought toward action, basically, that emphasizes meaning, how meanings are created within collectivities, how meanings fund and are reflected in collective action, the importance of iterations, right? the lack of teleology and the importance of contingency. So those kinds of things that I felt were also really reflected in the political philosophy, and I thought each one of these elements was really important in characterizing the more detailed framework that I then lay out.
Yeah, I'm glad you spoke directly to that word pragmatism, because I wondered about that. Just seeing the phrase,
Mm-hmm.
I wondered how you know how you were going to nuance that, and I think that's really nicely put, because it does have that
Mm-hmm.
everyday usage and the suspicions that come with it about being about compromise or middle ground, or this
Mm-hmm.
sort of the sort of media political discourse around that. But it cannot be attached to radical Black and feminist
Mm-hmm.
without either being a different sense of pragmatism, which you just articulated, but also what you also just articulated is the way that idea of pragmatism, because it's at the end of the phrase, is fundamentally modified by radical Black and feminist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are adverbs that really
Mm-hmm.
change the resonance of it. So I love the phrase, and I have to say, I don't work in the pragmatist tradition, but if this contributes to a revitalization of that term as a way of thinking rather than a way of selling out radicalism,
Yeah.
that would be really great, because part of all that stuff you were talking about in explicating the Black and the feminist as an ethic and politics, right? It changes that meaning of pragmatism in ways that I think you make really productive, and makes the term really productive for those of us thinking in slightly different registers, perhaps, about politics. Because
Yeah.
it's a key term, right? Pragmatism it's a movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just been corrupted. And I was glad to see it get sort of pulled off the. I don't know. I don't want to say the pulled off the skepticism pile, right? People are so skeptical about it.
Right. No, and it's okay. I think it's okay to be skeptical about it, because the sense in which I want to use it is it is it's about building. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit. Um, I do have to say that it's a little bit sort of writing against utopia. It's trying to write for imagination, but against utopia in a certain way. And I don't mean that as a hard line, because some people talk about utopian thinking in a very similar way that I mean pragmatic
Sure. Sure.
imagination. But I wanted to make it clear that that this movement didn't have a notion of like uh, inevitable transformation, or of revelatory transformation, right? That like people will wake up to something and then everything will be different, or instead, I really wanted to emphasize that quality of world building, of how do we make a bridge, right? Make the steps from this world to the one that we're imagining, but also, and this is important for the pragmatism part, also with the understanding that there's not a there that we get to, right?
Uh-huh.
That there's not a sort of equilibrium, steady state
Yeah.
that we get to, but instead it is that we walk in the liberatory process, right? That we're always in this process of getting free. Um, and that's just the way it is, right? And I think that is something that is characteristic of the pragmatist tradition, which is to say that we don't arrive at a perfect place, right? And that's not the goal, right? The goal is to sort of walk in the process of liberation, to walk in the process of getting free, and to trust ourselves and each other to continue to adapt and experiment and refine and revise and get it wrong and then do better.
I love that. That's fantastic. And thinking about pragmatism, imagination, and this sort of different movement, right? Of like what a future is, what accomplishment is. How do and you've spoken a little bit to this, but just to sort of center on this, how do you see this ethic of care, this politics of care and
Mm-hmm.
healing, functioning in this? Because it's that your treatment of care and healing in the third chapter
Mm-hmm.
was for me maybe my favorite part of the book. I thought it rehabilitated the idea of care and healing, as you did pragmatism, from this thing that people are very skeptical about care and healing are about the interpersonal rather than the
Yeah.
political, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't do that, right? You absolutely enmesh that in obviously political movement, but also what this pragmatic imagination is, what this radical imagination is, what this Black feminist imagination is.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to sort of ask you, what drew you to that characterization of care and healing, not just as a thing to talk about, but as something to really pull together the sensibilities of the movement.
I mean, it's because of what I found, right? Like, so
Yeah, yeah.
again, it was like through talking to people and, being with people in their spaces was, um, it was just something that people talked about all the time,
Yeah.
you know?
Okay.
And then it was
Great.
also
Love it.
really dominant in the discourse that I was seeing online, right? As well. It was just, um, so I had to kind of figure it out again. Like, my training is not here. Like, these are not categories that I
Uh-huh.
normally really understand or even hold to be valuable, right? In previous, in my previous sort of life as, a political scientist, because these are not things that are actually really valued, right? When we think about, liberal politics, and indeed, and I mean liberal in terms of philosophically liberal, right?
Sure.
In terms of liberalism, right? Emotion and its correlates are de-emphasized, right? As
Mm-hmm.
unimportant, as not what makes the human being special, as not what contributes to a well-run polity, right?
Uh-huh.
Those things are really de-emphasized and thought of as not serious. And so the fact that I was encountering them in movement spaces as so central and
Mm-hmm.
so serious, made me think about it. And made me really want to dig in and investigate what kind of political function that it was having, because it was clear from the very beginning that it was not mere sentiment, right? It really was not people, um, um, in a more kind of romantic, and I mean that's like historically, right, like philosophically, like romantic notion of care, but really it was a way that people tried to think through how to come together in organizations, how to organize politics, how to think about the sustainability and longevity of movement itself. Like, it was just such a backbone of thinking
Mm-hmm.
and action that I really had to try to investigate it. And as I sort of found that this actual framework of care politics that is in the Black Lives Matter movement is comes from disability justice, right? It comes from the
Huh.
disability
Uh-huh.
justice movement, and um, you know, in that way, it's also quite practical. So,
Yeah.
and that always is really resonant with me, right? And so it's really thinking about if we make if we want to make a politics in which many fewer people suffer and in which justice is possible, then we
Mm-hmm.
have to think about people as not only free floating cognition, but
Uh-huh.
embodied, um, 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 embodied and living creatures of reason.
Yeah.
Which means that we have to have a really different sense of what politics is for. And, feminist political theory talks a lot about care. There are those traditions. And then I also pull from the work of Joan Tronto, who talks about care as a kind of democratic ethic that ought to organize politics. But it's really Black feminism that takes me to an understanding of care as a main operative framework for how to think about um, political significance, political judgment, and political action, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through this, um, through this lens of um, who's suffering
Yeah.
and how to alleviate that suffering, not on an interpersonal or not only or primarily on an interpersonal basis,
Uh-huh.
but systemically, right? Like that is the thing that should be the anchor of our politics, right? And that's a really different way of thinking about politics
Absolutely.
than the 20th century philosophies.
And it really makes, I mean, it's an interesting hearing you talk about this and having retold this story about the corridor of
Yeah.
activists and
Mm-hmm.
the child and mother walking through, right? I mean, I don't know how to put it other than it just sounds sort of flat, but what happened to this child and this mother is like so deeply traumatic. And so the care and healing of this
Mm-hmm.
like corridor with a huge assist from the butterflies, it's like a little
Mm-hmm.
making me teary just thinking about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's interesting to also see that as like in a political action, right? And the
Right.
way it's not a sort of here are two people who need a little support and then we'll go do politics, but instead we're doing politics here and in this radical black feminist pragmatism.
Right, absolutely. Because it wasn't only about the assistance of those two people, right? Because
Yeah.
also in that moment was the codification of a way of working together and a clarification of the goals and a clarification of how actions should be chosen, right?
Yeah.
Sort of not merely or primarily on a kind of abstract level in terms
Mhm,
of like
mhm.
what level of action are you ready for? I mean, that is a question that is asked in spaces, right? Like, what level of direct action are you, willing to engage in, right? Like, but
Sure.
not merely from that perspective of what are you ready for, but really from the question of practical necessity,
Yeah.
right? Right. The goal here is to return this boy, to take him from a state which seeks to harm and destroy him and return him to the loving arms of his community. That's
Mhm.
the goal. That's the whole thing, right? And
Yeah.
so all of our and to understand that in a really practical and way, like an empirical way, right? Here it is, right here. Like this is the
Yeah.
thing we have to
Yeah.
do, and we have to do that even while we fight, and even while we're sniping at each other, and even while some of us are more militant than others, and we are at different life stages, and we have different sort of identity expressions, like with all of those differences and all of that plurality happening all the time, right?
Uh-huh.
um, this is a very concrete anchor,
Yeah.
right? On which to help us understand the purpose and significance of our action and its cause, right? Like yeah. So I just think that it was very, very important. It also sort of turns the this approach also kind of is quite appealing, I think, to the larger polity, right? Because you, the care emphasis, I think, is part of what made the movement so popular, right? So popular for a social movement. I don't think it's any kind of coincidence or mystery about why the circulation of the Audre Lorde quote about self-care, which was really just like it wasn't meant to be like a viral like sort of revolutionary like cultural moment, right? It wasn't meant to sort of like necessarily be injected into and then be immediately sort of grasped and co-opted by, of course, the capitalist system. But but the reason that it was is that it was so resonant, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because our notion of politics, but also just life, right, had been made to feel void of any room for care, right? The sort of political economy that we live in is one that demands work all the time in order to survive. And we are not meant to put anything above or before our work. And many of us, up and down, right, except at the very, very tip top of income distribution, find that we don't have time to care for ourselves or each other, let alone the polity, right? That's the other thing, is that democracy is actually an extremely demanding form of political organization and one that requires care.
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And we're living in a context in which care had been almost totally devalued in every kind of way, like every kind of way that you could imagine, right? Like materially, discursively, in terms of institutions and structures of support, but also ideologically, right? Like associated with people who are unserious, people who can't or don't reason, people who are soft, right? The feminine, right? Like, so really boldly putting that at the forefront of politics, I think was surprising to a lot of people and also connected to a lot of people, even if they weren't necessarily fully versed in the impacts of white supremacy and structural racism on so many domains of American life. But just this notion that people can matter, and that we need to say that, and that people and our politics should be organized around the fact that people matter, I think was quite powerful.
I think it's powerful, and having read the book and then hearing you talk about it also, that I think there's a real question about the durability of multiplicities, anchoring themselves in some meta ideological commitment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the stability of that is I think always it's flimsy. It's a long odds bet, but the existential dimensions of care, because we all need to be cared for. I mean, I don't want to sound, sentimental, except that care matters in ways that anchor us. And so it's so interesting to think about it as an anchor to a movement, right? Rather than a feature of a movement. And that is, a deep sense of ideology that is both capable of that weight of an anchor, but also something that we don't let go of, right? It's not flighty, it's not ephemeral at all. It's incarnate, it's and it requires, personal and polity work, right? It requires these multiple levels of work. So I really love that. I mean, like I said, it was my favorite chapter in the book, in large part because I think like care and healing are important, but the way they've been marginalized as not radical has always seemed to me to be, just to be blunt, like a really masculinist kind of lone wolf, young man willing to punch Nazis and, that sort of ethic, which is not unimportant in movements, but the way it marginalized this thing that is such an anchor to us at every phase of our lives, right? From birth to death. It adds an existential dimension to your broader sort of political claims, I think. But as you keep coming back to, this is an inductive moment, right? For you, this is not, Professor Woodly coming to the masses and giving them an idea, right? It's reading their conversations, right? Or even just flat out listening, even maybe not even reading.
Well, both, right? All of that. And what's also really important about care and healing justice is that, as it comes, from disability justice, this notion of healing is not just about personal healing. And the notion of care is also not just about personal care. And I agree with you about the existential dimensions, but what's nice about this concept of care is that it traverses every dimension, from the practical, the very much practical and quotidian, literal care, right? To this existential kind of notion that is captured in the name of the movement, which is like, how do we matter? Do we matter? Can we claim that? And what does it mean to claim that? And what actions does it demand of us? So it has all these layers, but also from the disability justice standpoint, healing justice is really important because the notion is that we cannot heal by ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? Is that especially if what ails us are structural conditions, then a part of our healing is moving to alter those conditions, to alleviate the causes of our suffering.
It politicizes institutions, which is, which is that, as you previously talked about, is such a key part of I mean, it's the subtitle, right? The
Yeah.
politicization
Yeah.
of institutions coming
Hmm.
through care and healing. I think this is just so incredibly important. And, the fact that you draw from these multiple sources and disability justice, activists and scholars, the more they become a part of how we talk about these things, the better. I mean, your book, I think, is a great embodiment of that.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, go from this, existential institutional care and healing to maybe kind of a bookish question or navel gazing invitation from you. But I
Okay.
wanted to ask you about, how you think about this book in relationship to your first book, The Politics of
Yeah.
Common Sense. So I
Hmm.
really love The Politics of Common Sense. You and I met at a symposium at
Oh,
UCLA.
great.
You gave a talk. I really liked your talk. So I ordered the book from my hotel room. It was there when I got home. I read it and I really loved it. And what I loved about it, it really did change the way I think about um, political language, right? Because it's
Hmm.
about about the discursive
Discourse.
dimensions of politics and
Hmm.
how discourse carries beyond the sort of successes and failures of movements in the moment, is able to
Hmm.
keep them circulating. Same-sex marriage,
Hmm.
to me, was one of the most compelling examples of that. And this is a very different book because it's not about discourse, right?
Hmm.
It's about care and healing and all of these ways you're talking about anchoring and in the broadest, most expansive sense of radical Black feminist pragmatism.
Hmm.
So, how do you see the relationship between the books? And if the answer is they're just two different books and they're two different parts of me, that's a very simple answer. But I also know that books change us as we write
Hmm.
them, and so they often address our own sensibilities and developments as thinkers.
Well, I mean, for me, the books are quite related. I mean, obviously they're very different, but both of these books are attempts to understand the process of meaning making. Because I think that meaning making is our most fundamental human process, but also our most fundamental political process. And in political science, we don't pay attention to it very much, even though it defines the horizons of possibility, right? And so for me, each of these books is a different way of trying to get at that meaning making process and what's political about it and how it shapes the horizons of possibility in, on different topics and in different moments of political time.
So let me ask you another book question, and this is about this is a book that comes is published. I mean, it's written across many years, and
Hmm. Yeah.
um, but it's written it's published, I should say, at a moment in which Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives has been a part of our political, and for those of us who are writers and thinkers, part of our intellectual life now for a decent number of years.
Yeah. Almost a
And so
decade.
it's kind of crazy to think about that. That's a
Hmm.
decade that flew by, but then what was happening 10 years ago is, just so different. But anyway, but of course, that also means that there are multiple other books that have come out, whether they're
Hmm.
memoirs,
Sure.
manifestos on the movements, or I'm thinking also of academics treating, I shouldn't say academic treatments, but academics treating the same
Hmm.
movement. I'm thinking of Kianga's book, which was,
Hmm.
I think one of the first academic books to come out on Black Lives Matter, and Chris
Hmm.
LeBron's book. And so I want to ask you about how you understand your book in relationship to that sort of, I would say, like an emerging writerly world, scholarship writerly world about Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. And you and I have talked about this previously. I don't mean that in like, why is your book better than all
Oh,
these
no.
others?
Yeah.
But really, what do you see as, what do you see your book opening up that other books have touched on or not quite gotten to? Like, what is the important thing opened up for your book in relationship to this emerging scholarly treatment?
Well, I think that my book is, I think that what I wanted to do with this book, and that I hope I did, was to start the book in the movement, right? and indeed to leave it there and to sort of try to understand what the movement is based in, what it's trying to do, and how it contributes to our understandings of politics, democracy, and possibility. But I didn't. So I wanted it to be an explication of the movement from accounts, right, inside the movement, and less a prescription for what the movement should do, or um, a meditation on the movement's relationship to um, other aspects of Black political thought, right? So I think all of that work is amazing, and also the memoirs that are the first-person accounts that have come out, people who, the political philosophers in the movement, right? Like Adrienne Maree Brown, who and Alexis Pauline Gumbs, right, who are writing about the ways that they're thinking about politics and strategy and care, right? Like all of that. Should be, is happening and should be happening. And I hope that there's only more proliferation. But I wanted to write something that was empirical, in that it was based on, what people were telling me, but also had, a real commitment to understanding how those findings should affect the rest of what we understand about politics, right? And I think that is, I think that that's relatively unique, and it's not something that everybody is going to like, right? Like this is not a book that's really about political refusal, right? In a way that annoys like many. Some interlocutors that I have had, and this is not a book that is only located in political theory or Black studies, which also sometimes annoys people. It is also not a book that is entirely, it doesn't have any regressions in it at all, right? That also annoys some people. And instead, it's a kind of melange that tries to tell an empirical story in a theoretical context that's meant to reorient us around what we think social movements do. And it's meant to influence the epistemology of politics as we understand it, as a discipline, but also as a vocation.
That's great. And, I think about the books that are emerging, and, as always happens when multiple books emerge around a political issue or, some sort of event of some kind or scholarship moment. There is such a tendency to sort of constrain proliferation, but, my hope is that, we just keep getting more books that pick up different aspects of this, because I think, one of the things that your book and other books do is to serve as reminders to us as scholars and people existing in the world and everything in between, reminds us that this is a movement on par with, the civil rights movement, with Reconstruction, with abolition. And so, no one ever says like, we need fewer books on, the civil rights movement, or it needs to only be this, or, I think I just hope that in this moment, as we're sort of writing history in the present, and doing, taking account of the present, that ethic of proliferation and multiple aspects and healthy debates and distinctions, as you say, certain interlocutors, resist this or that. I think your book does a really good job of being a challenge to whatever different views there are, and I hope that takes up place of conversation and debate about the ultimate meanings of this moment.
Well, and I think that they should be debated and acted upon forever. I mean, I don't think, I would go even further. I mean, what I tried to do in thinking and talking about the political philosophy of this movement, and really talking about Black feminism, and radicality and pragmatism in this way, is that I really think that it's even more than just this movement is on par with other kinds of Black liberation movements that have taken place. I think that the political philosophy is important because it also allows us a glimpse and a path forward, in a way that exceeds the political philosophies that characterize the 20th century. So for me, it's much bigger than that. And there should be proliferation, not only because it's like good, in terms of like intellectual interchange and these are worthy topics, but there should be proliferation because in order for radical Black feminist pragmatism and a politics of care to be a politics that can actually characterize and shape the activity, right, of the 21st century, there has to be proliferation. There has to be saturation of thought about this. We have to have, disagreements. There have to be camps, right? There's not only one big book on liberalism, right? There are thousands of books on it, and people sort themselves into camps about it, and they reinterpret again and again, right? Different, that's because that's what it means to be a paradigmatic, frame of thought. Yeah. And I believe this can be a paradigmatic frame of thought and should be.
And that's why, if I can just be disciplinary about it, I think that's why this is important for political scientists to take seriously. Because I think that's a lot of what you're talking about is this disciplinary expertise of political science that I think really comes out in the book, especially because your political science approach is inductive and empirical.
Mm-hmm.
So books get published, right? They go out there, people read them, which is wonderful and often anxiety producing.
Yes.
What readers take away from it. I mean, you've already talked about this a bit. What readers take from the book is sort of, their own adventure, right? As readers,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
But also as authors, we do have an idea of, what we hope, right? It was put it in a non-imperial sense. It's not what we demand,
no.
But what we hope people take away from the book, how they walk away from it, what sort of the ways their sensibilities are changed. And what do you think as the author, what do you hope is the sensibility transformation that happens for us as readers of your book?
Well, I think that what I hope most of all is that I hope readers walk away from the book thinking what I thought as I was encountering the movement, which is that it makes people understand the mechanics of political possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes people understand themselves as a people in a political time, right? A political set of generations that are as much capable and responsible of shaping the world as any other people in any other political time. Part of what I'm really aiming toward and writing for is, a feeling of, and part of the reason why I don't, why I try to avoid expressing like sort of fealty to any one ideological train of thought from the 20th century is because I really wanted to emphasize what I felt from speaking to people in movement spaces and being able to be a guest, right? In those spaces was this understanding of the livingness of this political moment, and the sense that you don't have to take sides in the 20th century debates, and we don't have to, and that we should be actually trying to exceed those things, that we should be able to depart, right, as Audre Lorde says, from the shoreline, right, of modernity and set sail for a new era, and that we can do that. And indeed, it's our responsibility to do that. And this is a way forward. So that's what I want people to take from it. Not to say that I've gotten everything right and it's all their particulars, or to say that my tone is exactly what people will appreciate, or to, like, it's not a perfect book, but I do want it to convey, and what I want people to really take away from it is this understanding of possibility and the necessity of embracing that possibility in really radical and practical ways.
And what about you? I mean, we as writers enter books and exit books to different people.
Yeah.
How have your sensibilities been changed in the process of writing the book?
Um, they've been so changed. I think that's part of why it was so hard to write. As I said, really thinking through the implications of care and taking it seriously,
Mm-hmm.
really thinking about embodied existence and taking it seriously, really thinking about the ways that, joy and pleasure are necessary, not only personally, but as social and political resources. Um, all of those things were things that didn't I hadn't focused on before, not only in my scholarship, but I also think, like, as a person. I've
Huh.
been very I'm very cognitively centered, right? In a very kind of masculinist and Western way, right? Like, sort of my training, um, um, and um, and so for me, this book opened up a different kind of depth and emphasis, I think, in my own life, but also in my own politics that won't change. Also, the book made me an abolitionist. I wasn't when I started writing it, which was a big change.
That's no
So,
small thing.
yeah. And the way that I came to it, again, like, the way that I came to it is not, was really through data and the examinations that I had to undergo because of the things that people were telling me, and the ways that they were proposing to shape policy, and in thinking through um, what came to be, what came to me to seem the most sort of most sensical, right, sort of political stance. Um, um, it also made me consider the ways, right, like, what are the viewpoints through which an abolitionist politics makes sense. And it's there's one way to get to it through data. I mean, and I think that that's the way that I approached it in the first place, because, as I said, like, that's how I'm keyed. I'm
I
just
was
keyed
going to
to, like,
say that would be the cerebral part.
yeah, like that's the kind of way that I'm keyed. I'm just like, oh, like, all of this money is being spent. We actually don't have very good data, which always makes me very suspicious. The data that we have says that none of these approaches actually do the thing that they're meant to do. That keys up Foucault for me, which means that means that the system is doing a thing other than what it purports to be wanting to do. And also, we have all this empirical evidence about the things that actually do what policing is supposed to do and never has and doesn't, while
Mhm.
also creating all of this harm. So there is a way there through that, and that's actually the way that I got there. But then once that you get there, it's also, when you're thinking and talking about harm instead of crime, then you have to also start thinking about care.
Yeah.
And as you're thinking about care, you also are starting to think about pleasure. And not only that, you're also trying to start thinking about things like, when you start thinking about safety, you also start thinking about things like well-being and flourishing, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I kind of backed into those concepts,
Amazing.
relatively reluctantly and unwillingly, but there was nothing I could do to avoid them, because in order to understand the subject that I had set for myself, I had to be, as they say, transformed in the service of the work.
I love that. I'm so glad I asked. So I appreciate so much you taking all this time to talk about your book. I mean, I think it's such an important book. It's super interesting, really, really vital for all of us who care about the question of racial justice, and critique of the state and democracy. For what it's worth, whatever content is in it. I've never liked the word democracy, but it's a book that made me think a lot more about the word democracy, a lot more sympathetically. And so, I love the book, but, hearing you talk about it has just been wonderful. It adds so much texture to the book that is already itself very textured. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk.
Yay.
It was really
Thank you for inviting me. It was really wonderful to talk about these processes. It's a part that usually you don't get to talk about. So it's actually been a fantastic experience.
Great. Well, when your next book comes out, we'll meet again in a podcast. All right. Well, take care.
Thank you. You too, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye.